we're going to start from the beginning now. From the beginning of Masechta, we'll try to go through it fast and just a good review, fast, short, and sweet review. So we're going to start from page 2A. Page 2A, and I'm sure in the art scroll it's 2A1. Sukkah shigavay lamayla me'asher mama. Sukkah that is tall, above 20 amas. It's above 20 cubits. Psula, it is invalid. That means that if it's exactly 20 cubits, it's good. It's above 20 cubits, it is puzzle, it is invalid. Rabbi Yehuda machshir, but Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. And he allows a sukkah to be above 20 amas, 20 cubits. The Gemara will tell us the reason for the rabbis why above 20 cubits is not good. We saw a few reasons, and we'll soon see in the Gemara. If the sukkah does not have three walls, meruba. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. If it's not tall 10 tefachim, if it doesn't have three walls, and if its sun, is more than its shade, psula, it is invalid. So the three scenarios in the end of the Mishnah are that it doesn't have the height that it needs. It needs to have a minimum of 10 cubits and 10 hand breadths, and it needs to have a minimum of three walls, and it needs to have a minority of sunlight and a majority of shade. And of course, one of the things that we discussed is what happens if it's half and half. And the simple understanding is that if it's half and half schach, that means if it has a half.
You're frozen again.
A kosher sukkah, you need to have on the bottom, meaning
you were just frozen again for a minute.
Oh, okay. Now good.
Yeah.
Now it's good. Okay. So the all I said was that one of the questions that is discussed is what happens if it's half and half. Here we see that it's invalid if it's majority sunlight. So does that mean that all you need is to have half and half, and that would be a kosher sukkah? Or do you need to have majority shade in order for it to be a kosher sukkah? So the simple answer to that is that if on top of the sukkah it is half and half schach and half sunlight, so that would mean that in the sukkah itself, you will have the majority shade. So which means that on the top, if you just talk about the schach, you don't need to have majority schach versus a minority of empty space, but it would be good enough to have half and half. And if you have too little of the schach, that would be a problem. But if you have half and half, it would be kosher, because that would make that on the bottom, in other words, in the sukkah, would end up being majority shade and a minority sunlight. So bottom line is the Mishnah spoke about four situations. One of them was where the sukkah is too tall, and the other was where it's maybe too short, or it's doesn't have enough walls, or it has too much sunlight. So those are the four scenarios of the Mishnah.
We're reviewing, so this is the first page.
I didn't hear you. Say that again.
Sorry, I wasn't muted.
Oh, okay. Okay, so now we're going to do the Gemara. Gemara says, Tanan Hasam, we learned over there, Mavoy Shehu Gavoya Meyasrim Ama Yamayit. We learned over there in a Mishnah, the Mishnah says that a Mavoy, which is a type of alleyway that it's closed off in three of the directions, and the fourth direction you want to close it off in order to be able to carry on Shabbos from the different courtyards to the mavui, from the different courtyards to each other, and through the mavui, through the alleyway, and go into carry from people's houses to the courtyards, so on to the alleyway. So in order to do that, you need to close off the fourth direction, the fourth wall, so to speak. But the thing is that doesn't need to be closed off as a wall. There are two ways to close it. One is to make some type of a pole, put a pole at the end of the by the end of that area that's open, either the beginning of it or at the end of it, and you put a pole there, and that would be like a hecker. That fourth wall is really like it's closed off. The other way of doing it is putting a beam on top. So the Mishnah talks about what happens. You have this beam going across, but it's very high up. If it's very high up, then the Mishnah in Eruvin says, "Mavoi shehu gavaya meyas rumama." If a mavoi has a beam that is above 20 amos, you got to lower it. Rav Yehuda Eimer Einay Tzarach, and Rav Yehuda says you don't need to lower it. It is good enough. It is good enough the way it is. Now, the Gemara is bothered with why our Mishnah says if it's valid or invalid, and the Mishnah in Eruvin talks about if it's you have to lower it or you don't have to lower it. Maishna gabe sukkah detani psula, maishna gabe mavi detani takanta. Why by sukkah does it say it's invalid? Why by mavui, in case of in Eruvin, where it talks about a beam that's too high, you want to use it as a fourth wall, but why over there does it not use the term valid or invalid? It uses the term lowering it or not lowering it. Why over there does it say to lower it? So seemingly it could have said the same thing by sukkah, that sukkah, you instead of it being 20 amos tall, why don't you just lower the schach and lower the top of your walls, and you'll have a lower. So no, it could have said the same words here, or the same thing in Eruvin. It could have said valid or invalid. So the Gemara says, Sukkah da'araisa tani psula. The sukkah is a biblical law that it needs to be within 20 amos, at least according to the first opinion, Tanakama. It's a biblical law that it has to be below 20 amos or below, 20 cubits or below. And therefore, it says that it's invalid. So it says psula. Mavoi, but in the Mishnah that talks about mavoi, that it's a case that's derabanan, it's rabbinic. It's a rabbinic law, the whole idea, because biblically, all you need is 3 walls in order for it to be a kosher sukkah. And the fourth wall, you don't really need in order for it to be a kosher eruv. And the fourth wall, you really don't need. So the fact that you're going to have a fourth wall is only a rabbinic law. And there, the wall you made was too tall. Why was it too tall? Because it's above 20 amos. And according to the according to the laws of Eruvin, the rabbinic laws, it needs to be it needs to be 20 amos or below. And so therefore, if since it's only rabbinic, it says the takana that you should lower it. Now, the way Rashi translates this, we explained when we learned it, that Rashi understands this to mean that it'll say by a biblical law, it'll say if it's valid or invalid, because when you say invalid, what you're saying is it's already been decided that it's invalid. By rabbinical law, you can't really say invalid because it implies in the past it has been decreed that it's invalid. And really, the rabbis are exactly doing that. It's a work in progress, so to speak. It's the rabbis are actually telling us right now that it's invalid. And because of that, the Mishnah there cannot say the word it's invalid as if it's invalid from the past. It's not true. It's only currently becoming invalid because we're deciding that we're making it now invalid. And therefore, the wording wouldn't fit with the using the term puzzle by a rabbinic law. And therefore, it only says the word Yemait over there by Eruvin. It would say that you lower it, but it won't say puzzle. And now the Taisus over here learns a little differently. He says that if it would say that you should lower if it would say that you should lower the sukkah by sukkah, so you have a too tall, your sukkah is too tall, and if it would say to lower it, what that would mean is, you might think at least that it would mean that it would be valid after the fact. That maybe the preferable thing would be to lower it, but it sounds that if it says to lower the sukkah, it sounds like maybe that means that you could lower it, and if you didn't, you should lower it. But if you didn't, it would still be valid, b'diavad, and that is not correct. And therefore, when it comes to sukkah that's d'oraisa, that's biblical, we have to be extra careful that a person won't make a mistake. The rabbinic law we're not afraid of. Now, as a biblical law, you have to cover yourself. The rabbis had to cover themselves to state clearly it's invalid, because if a person would make a mistake, they would be transgressing a biblical law. But a rabbinic law, if a person made a mistake, it wouldn't be it would not be an issue that someone might make a mistake there, and they might say, "Oh, I thought it's only preferable that I need a mavoi needs a beam above." We're not obligated to be so concerned about that. Possibly even if a person made a mistake, he wouldn't be considered transgressing, even because it's a mistake on a rabbinic law. There's discussion about that, very interesting discussion. We did talk a little about if a person makes a mistake on a rabbinic law, would he be considered transgressing? Because the rabbinic law is not intrinsic to the act. It's more of a prohibition on the person, and therefore if a person made a mistake, not necessarily would that be considered a transgression. There's a source in the Shulchan Aruch. There is such a source, not that everyone agrees with it, but there is a source, there is an opinion that says that such a scenario, person made a mistake on a rabbinic law, maybe he doesn't even need to do tshuva, doesn't have to repent, because it's not intrinsically connected to the item. It's more of a personal, it's more of a obligation on the person, and if the person did it by mistake, it wouldn't be considered a transgression. It's all about rebelliousness or not, listening or not listening. And again, the person didn't know, so he didn't know any better. So here we have the way Tosfos is understanding it, that the word yamayit, lowering, is a term that could imply that you could lower it or make your sukkah lower. It would imply, if it said that, it would imply like it would be kosher if you didn't, but we want you to lower it. And the same thing would apply to mavoi. It could mean someone could make a mistake and think that it means we would like you to lower your beam in order to make your fourth wall of your, for Shabbos would be considered a fourth wall of your alley, and that would be kosher. But if you didn't, it would be okay. And therefore, when it comes to the biblical law, sukkah, the Mishnah said we can't use that word yimai because someone will make such a mistake. When it comes to the rabbinic law, we don't have to be so worried, and if someone would make such a mistake because it's only rabbinic, and therefore it would be okay. That's so that's basically the way Tosfos is. That's the first interpretation of Tosfos, and Tosfos adds one more point there. Actually, he says that the rabbis would rather say yamayit, lower it instead of puzzle, because puzzle is considered like a very harsh term. It's invalid. So the rabbis generally, in general, we try to always speak with a more refined language. So anyway, so that was the way Tosfos understands that. Really, we would want to do yamayit. We would want to say lower it, but if you can't because it's a biblical law, so we'll say that it's invalid. Then Tosfos has another interpretation over here that the word yamayit implies a rabbinic. Just the word sounds like it's rabbinic, and valid or invalid sounds like it's biblical. That's another understanding of way Tosfos learns. In any event, the Gemara here tells us the difference between the wording by Sukkah versus the wording by Eruvin. Now, the Gemara gives one more answer, and that is Vibayasem. If you want, you could say another answer, but the Raisa Nami Tani Takanto, that by the biblical, it could have said Yemayit, and it would have been okay. We would have been able to say Yemayit, and it wouldn't have been a problem. However, because the Mishnah mentions numerous cases, because there's numerous cases in our Mishnah, Pasik Vatani Psula, it mentioned the word Psula, Mavi Delay Nafish Mile, Tani Takantan, Mavoi, by the case of the alley, where it's not so many, it doesn't mention so many cases. So in that case, that Mishnah there, it could use the word Yemayit because it would be simple. Our Mishnah would be complicated because if it would say Yemayit, so it would say a sukkah that's too tall, you have to lower it. A sukkah that has only two walls and not three, you have to add a wall. A sukkah that's less than 10 tvachim, you have to make it higher. A sukkah that's too much sunlight and shade, you have to add schach. So it would have to make, if you're starting to tell people what to do to fix things, then it's going to be too wordy, too verbose, and therefore it specifically just says a simple thing, puzzle. It is invalid. Then comes the next piece of Gemara, Menahani Mili. So how do we know that a sukkah cannot be higher than 20 amas? The Gemara says that Amar Rabba says Damar Kra, because the verse says L'man Yedu Deresechem, that in order that the generations will know that the way he's translating it, I should say, the way Rabba is going to translate this verse, the simple meaning is that they will know that when you left Egypt, I put the Jewish people in clouds of glory. That would be the simple reading, the common understanding of the verse. But the way Rabba's learning it is that in order that generations will know that on Sukkot I commanded you to dwell. In other words, that you should know, generations should know, that I am commanding you to dwell in a sukkah. So you should be able to know this while you're dwelling in the sukkah, that you are, in other words, you should know that you're in a sukkah. That you should know that you're commanded, in other words, your command to be in a sukkah, you're commanded to know that you're in a sukkah. So the way he understands it is that you have to be able to see the schach. You have to be able to know that you're in a sukkah. Now, if it's too tall, you won't know that you're in a sukkah. So let me just read the Rashi over here. It says, in order that you should know, Rashi says, make a sukkah that its dwelling will be recognizable to you. As it says, Yedu, they should know, they should know that I commanded them to dwell in a sukkah. And Rashi then says, even though the simple meaning is referring to the clouds of glory, but this is the meaning. So he's translating it, Laman Yedu, that they should know that they are commanded to dwell in a sukkah, which means that they should know that I'm commanding them to dwell in the sukkah, that they see the schach. They should recognize that. So the understanding is that it's you have to be able to see the schach. So the Gemara Rabbah expounds on this verse, and he says, until 20 amas, the person knows that he's dwelling in a sukkah. Above 20 amas, person does not know that he's dwelling in a sukkah, because his eye doesn't dwell on the schach. In other words, a person doesn't really know that he's dwelling in the sukkah because his eyes don't really they don't gaze upon the schach because it's so high up. So the next so that's the first that's the first explanation of the reason why a sukkah can't be 20 amas high, above 20 amas high. So the next answer is Reb Zera. Reb Zera Omar, Reb Zera says, Mehacha, you learn it from another pasuk in Yeshaya, which we've seen before a few times. The sukkah tiyol l'tzel yoimam. The sukkah should be for shade during the day, mechayra from the heat, from the sun, from the heat. Now, ad esr mama, until 20 amos, Adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah. A person dwells in the shade of a sukkah. L'mayla me'esr mama, ein adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah, ela b'tzel defanis. A person doesn't dwell in the shade of a sukkah, only in the shade of the walls. And what that means is that when a sukkah is so tall, you don't really benefit from the schach. You're not benefiting from it. It's impossible to benefit from it because it's so high up, and the walls are really going to be what's blocking the sun, not the schach. The only time that the schach will be blocking is only if the sun is exactly above, and it's very rare for such a thing to happen that the sun would be exactly above, and therefore it would be considered that you're dwelling not in the shade of the sukkah, and therefore it would be invalid. Amalei Abaye asks, Selamiyata, if so, would it also not be a sukkah if a person made a sukkah in a area that's called Ashtres Karnayim, where it's a valley in between two big mountains because they're so high, so the sun does not shine in the valley part. So are you going to say that also will not be a kosher sukkah because you're dwelling in the shade of the you're dwelling in the shade of the mountains and not in the shade of the schach? Amar le. So Reb Zera answered back to Abaye Hassam over there, Dal Ashtres Karnayim. If you would remove the outer external obstacle, which is the mountains of Ashtres, the mountains of that place, Ashtres Karnayim, Ikatzel Sukkah, you do have the shade of the sukkah. Hachadal Defanis Lekatzel Sukkah, but here you remove the walls, you will not have the shade of a sukkah. If you remove here, your walls are 20 amos high, so if you remove the walls, the sun will all enter, and you won't have the shade of a sukkah because your schach is basically not going to be accomplishing anything, and basically the sukkah is invalid above that height because of the shade is not really accomplishing what it needs to. Now, according to the way Reb Zera is learning, it is interesting because this is really a verse from Isaiah, and we mentioned this at how do you learn from a verse from Isaiah about the obligation of a sukkah, and in other words, it should be written in the Torah. So seemingly he's telling us that it's not that you're learning from that verse a law, but you're learning simply what the word sukkah means. Sukkah is meant to be for sale. Now the interesting thing is, okay, so that answers that question. The only thing is that in that verse it says sukkah is for sale from the chayrev, and that it also says mizdarem umimater in that verse from the winds and from the rain. So it sounds like the sukkah is not only for shade, but it's for other things as well. And that seemingly is a problem for various reasons that the sukkah would be protecting from. If the sukkah is meant to protect from rain, it doesn't fit with other gemaras, which we learned in kindness about the rain is a siman klala, it's a curse on sukkahs if you have rain. So how would that fit if it's meant to be a protection from rain? That would be contrary to what the whole understanding that rain is considered bad on sukkahs. So Taisus answers that the point, the way Taisus answers this question is that the idea of schach is that it has to be temporary, that it's a shade. In other words, we know that a sukkah is meant to be temporary. So even though the pasuk there talks about a protection from rain and from other things, that's regarding that pasuk. But the word and the mitzvah of sukkah definitely means a temporary dwelling. So in other words, we're not going to use the word sukkah to teach us anything about the rain element and about the other things. We're using simply the idea that a sukkah is meant for shade, and we know sukkah means a temporary dwelling. So therefore, it obviously is not going to protect you from the rain. We're not going to learn that from that pasuk. There, it's talking about loss of Levi in the future when there's going to be protection from all elements. Here, we're just using the idea that sukkah means from rain. Now, there are other answers to this question, and that is that it says that if you look at that entire pasuk, it says it does say other words there. It says the mechsa ula miftar. It says it's a protection and it's a blockage from the other element. So you could learn that sukkah means a protection from sun, and the word mechsa, which would mean it's a refuge, that would mean from the wind. Ulamistar in a blockage would mean from the rain. So in other words, the word sukkah actually is only referring to the shade part, and that's how we can learn that sukkah means shade. That has to be majority shade, and therefore, and therefore, if the sukkah is too tall and it's not giving shade because the walls are too tall and it's only and the schach is not giving shade, that would be an invalid sukkah, because we see sukkah means that it has to be giving shade. Now, the next answer of the Gemara is that Rava Amar, and Rava says from here. Rava says that you learn it, that you learn the obligation of a sukkah to be 20 amas, not higher than 20 amas, is from the fact that it says Basukkah Teishu Shivas Yom, that it says that in sukkahs they should dwell 7 days, and Amra Torah, the Torah says Kol Shivas Hayam and same Diras Keva v'Shiva Diras Aron. That all 7 days you go outside of a permanent dwelling and you go into a temporary dwelling. Ad Esrim Amma Adam Aisa Dirasi Diras Aron. Up to 20 amas, the person dwells temporarily. You don't dwell in a temporary dwelling when it's 20 amas tall. It's not going to be temporary. This is going to be a permanent dwelling. In other words, that in order for a building to last, to be tall, 20 amas, it needs to be made from a more permanent, with more permanent foundation. And if the Torah tells us that we're supposed to dwell in a sukkah for 7 days, that means that it's supposed to be a temporary dwelling, not a permanent dwelling. And if you're building a sukkah that's 20 amas, over 20 amas tall, that means that it's a permanent dwelling, and that would not be a kosher sukkah. And the Gemara says, Amalei Abaye asks the question on this statement of Rava that seemingly it's not so. Seemingly that you can't really say that, because what about if you made a sukkah out of iron? If so, if you made walls of iron, is that going to be a problem to be a kosher sukkah? Are you going to say that's not a kosher sukkah? So you said it has to be a temporary dwelling. So Amarle, so Rava answers back, this is what I meant to say. Ad Esrim Amma, up to 20 amas, a person could make his dwelling a temporary dwelling. So even if you made it permanent, Nami, if you also made it a permanent dwelling, Nafik, you have fulfilled your obligation. The Milam Yasser Mama, or I should the person makes his dwelling a permanent dwelling, like out of iron. Nami Nafik, he also fulfilled his obligation. The Milam Yasser Mama, But if it's above 20 amas, otherwise that a person has to make it with a strong foundations and pegs and strong walls. So a person has to make it that way. Even if a person made it weak, nami loy nafik, he also doesn't fulfill his obligation because the sukkah is a height that is a permanent height. So in other words, the point of making the sukkah, the point of this law of 20, the point of the idea of the diras teva, diras arai, that Torah tells us 7 days, is not that it should be a sukkah that is temporary and it's going to fall apart in 7 days, but rather that it is a sukkah that is made in a way that could be a 7-day sukkah. When you make it out of iron, but at least you made it in a size that could be made in a 7-day way. Why? Because you didn't make it so tall. So you happen to use iron to make it, but the height of it is made in a way that it would be easy to be a temporary sukkah. It's a temporary height. Above 20 amas, we don't call a temporary height. Above 20 amas, that's called a permanent height. And therefore, the Torah is telling you need to make a sukkah of a temporary height, not of a permanent height. Can you make it out of permanent walls? Yeah, but it has to be a height that's a temporary height. A sukkah above 20 amas is not permanent. What?
At the end, I take the water and I pour it over the top so the nipples also water.
Yeah, let me mute everyone.
Oh, I think this is what I want.
Okay. Now comes the next. We turn the page. We're on page 2b. Hulu karabale amri. They all don't agree. The other two opinions don't want to learn like Rab. But actually, before we jump to here, I did want to mention the bottom Tosfos over here. He mentions that how do you know to learn the verse this way? In other words, it sounds very nice that you came up with an interpretation, but who says you have to learn it this way? Maybe you could learn that the sukkah could have to be a sukkah made out of temporary material. Maybe some wood or even flimsier than wood, plastic and things. But who says that maybe the sukkah, the Torah is telling you that it needs to be a sukkah that's a temporary sukkah, and it should only be made out of temporary things. It shouldn't be held down, and you shouldn't use a metal frame and a solid, strong sukkah. So Tosfos' answer is an interesting answer. He says that it would be impossible for the Torah to tell us that that the sukkah has to be a sukkah that's going to fall apart. It's too hard to figure out. It would be impossible to make such a calculation. A sukkah, a 7-day sukkah. But if it's telling you a height, that we could understand. That's easier to. That's a normal thing to expect people to do. Again, the Torah can't demand things out of people. We're not angels that we know everything. That we know how to do things exactly, precisely, and we know exactly what size a sukkah and how much would be permanent and how much would be temporary for a 7-day. And to know exactly what a sukkah would to make a sukkah last for 7 days would be impossible for people to calculate. How strong does it have to be? 1 nail instead of 2 nails, and only 3-inch nails instead of 4-inch nails. It would be impossible to calculate such a thing. So the Torah is basically telling us that it must be a measurement, because that's something that's possible for people to do. Now, Tosfos also deals with what would happen if a person made a sukkah in a more permanent way. That, in other words, if you're allowed to make a sukkah permanent, Tosfos here deals with what happens if you made schach that's permanent and the rain actually doesn't fall in. Would that be considered a kosher schach? In other words, if you tied down, the Gemara is basically telling us that as long as the height is good, then it's okay. So what happens if you make a sukkah that's that the height is good because it's less than 20 amas, but you really make it permanent in a way that the rain can't fall in? Would that be considered? And you use kosher schach, but you made it in a way that the rain can't fall in. He says it seems to be problematic because we know that again, similar to what I mentioned earlier, that it's supposed to rain. If it rains on sukkah, it's supposed to be a bad sign, but it's not true, because if you're allowed to make a sukkah that's permanent, then why would it be considered a bad omen? If it rains on sukkahs. If we just saw over here that you can even have a solid sukkah, so it could be that it's a permanent. It could be that it's permanent. Are we ready to go? We're waiting for me? No. Putting what? Okay. Okay, fine. So Tosis tells us that that the answer that I gave earlier is where Tosis says the same point, that the Chachamim understood that a sukkah needs to be the schach needs to be temporary. There's no question that the sukkah could be permanent, but the schach itself, that's got to be a temporary. The schach itself has to be temporary, and so even though our Gemara tells us that the sukkah could be a permanent sukkah, but nevertheless, it needs to be able to rain through the top. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a permanent. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be a sukkah. Okay, so then that's how Tosfos explains that. Yes, we're saying that the sukkah is permanent, no problem, but it still has to be able to rain through it because the schach can't be permanent. The sukkah should be permanent. And so now back to the Gemara. The Gemara on page 2b. The Gemara says, "Kulu karabba amri." They all do not hold like Rabbah, who you deal with dirty, because Rabbah's opinion. The Rabbah brings a pasuk. What's the pasuk that Rabbah talks about? The Rabbah brought a pasuk that Laman Yedu Deresechem, that in the future they should know that they're dwelling in a sukkah. And that pasuk is really talking about not when you're fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah, but you should know about. I'm sorry. It's not about when you're fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah that you know that you're in a sukkah, but that when you're fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah, that you know about what happened in the past, about future generations knowing that that the Yidden dwelled in these clouds of glory. So that is that's the reason why they don't want to learn from that pasuk, that it means you need to see the schach. The Rabbah learned that you need to see the schach. The rabbis don't agree. The other rabbis don't agree with that. That's not talking about seeing the schach, seeing that you're dwelling in a sukkah. I mean, you should see that you're dwelling in a. You should be able to know that the future generation should know that when Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, He gave us. He gave our parents, our ancestors, the clouds of glory. So no, it's not really saying you should know that you're a sukkah. You should know that this is commemoration of the sukkahs of the past, not that you know that you're dwelling inside a sukkah, that you see the schach. So again, they don't agree with Rabbah's reason. Reb Zera, they don't like Reb Zera's reason. According to Reb Zera, Zera had said that the reason that sukkah should be for itself from the sun. So a person dwells in the a person is up to 20 amos. A person is dwelling in the shade of the schach of the sukkah, but above 20 amos, he doesn't dwell in the shade of the sukkah. Now, it has to be giving shade under it. Now, if it's above 20 amos, it doesn't give shade. That was the explanation. So, I'm sorry, I skipped the line here. To Reb Zera nami layami. That's where we're up to. I skipped a few words. To Reb Zera nami layami. They don't say like Reb Zera. Again, Reb Zera said about the sukkah being for shade, and above 20 amos, it's the shade of the walls. So they don't want to hold like Rav Zera because that pasuk is talking about that Hashem is going to make for the righteous these type of tents, type of sukkahs that will protect the righteous in the time in the future. Ready to go? Okay. So that doesn't work. So that's for when Mashiach comes. It's not talking about a sukkah that that a sukkah should be for itself. So Reb Zera, what does Reb Zera do with that? It's really talking about the future. So Reb Zera answers him. Reb Zera says, if so, then the pasuk could say that the it doesn't have to say, if it only wanted to tell us about the future, could have said that they're going to that Hashem's going to make for the righteous in the future, going to make a chuppah type of protection. But why does it say a canopy? Why does it say my sukkah? But why does it say the word sukkah? Tarti is trying to tell us two things. Number one, of course, that's going to be what's going to happen when the Sheikh comes for the righteous. The other thing is it's also telling us that a sukkah, the concept of a sukkah is that it has to be fit. It has to give shade from the sun. That's the whole purpose of a sukkah, and that's teaching us about the Torah and the Torah law. Again, it's not. We're not that we're learning something from Yeshaya, that we're not learning a halacha there, but we're learning simply what the word sukkah means. It's supposed to be shade from the sun, and therefore it has to be, the sukkah has to give shade, not the walls. And then karava nami le'amri, they don't hold like Rava, and the reason why don't they learn like Rava? Because mishum kushya Abaye, because of the question of Abaye, that Abaye asked the question that if so, what's going to be with a sukkah made out of iron? That a sukkah made out of iron. That is not going to be if it needs to be a temporary sukkah. So how are you allowed to make a sukkah out of iron? That was Abaye's question. So because of Abaye's question, the other rabbis don't like, even though he answered it and he said no, it means the measurement, but nevertheless he says no, it has to be. They understand that means it has to be made out of made temporary, and therefore if you're going to learn like Rava said that it should be temporary, I'm coming in 1 minute. So if it's going to be like temporary, then you should also, if you're going to learn there that it means it has to be temporary, then you should also learn that it shouldn't be made out of iron, and therefore it's not, and therefore it's not going to be a valid. Therefore, it's not going to be. It's not going to be a good explanation why the sukkah can't be above 20 amas, because they don't like that the way to learning from that pasuk. Because if you learn from that pasuk, then you wouldn't be allowed to make an iron sukkah. We're going to stop here a little early, and sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi. Hatzlacha Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.